Всем привет, меня зовут Михаил Светов, спасибо, что подключились к эфиру. У меня в гостях сегодня американский националист, политик, автор термина alt-right Ричард Спенсер, и дальше мы будем говорить на английском, поэтому всех предупредил. Спасибо большое. So, hello everyone. My guest tonight is American nationalist, author of a term alt-right. I guess you coined it, or at least popularized it, Richard Spencer, a very controversial figure in the West. I think he was banned from entering 26 or 36 European countries at one point, and who recently underwent quite a transformation from being this bombastic leader of the alt-right and saluting Trump, to basically holding a centrist liberal views on a majority of contemporary issues. I guess you even called Joe Biden the best president of your lifetime at one point, which surprised me immensely when I was preparing for the show. Richard supports U.S. efforts in Ukraine today. So before we start, I would love you to explain your worldview, basically where you stand today, and how did this change happen from basically the leader of alt-right to someone who supports Biden?
First off, thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be here. And I am very enthusiastic about explaining these things. I'll admit that perhaps someone encountering me right now for the first time, or perhaps someone who might have heard of me 5 years ago and then is watching this, will think that I'm a slippery fish of sorts, or that I've repudiated everything and apologized to everyone and fallen on a sword and all that kind of stuff. And that's not exactly accurate. So where should I start? I'll first off start just with the Biden thing. I found Donald Trump's presidency to be a combination of disappointment and a toxic brew of poison, dead rodents, and witchcraft. It was a kind of a remarkable thing in the sense that, in terms of things that he really could have done that are mainstream nationalist positions, as I understood them, reform immigration, build the wall, have a national health care system, all these kinds of things, which I supported, he ultimately failed on many of those. Some of them, it's complicated, but it was ultimately a failure. But in terms of his actual presidency, the personality cult became something so immensely toxic that I don't really want to have anything to do with it. And I do find him fascinating. And I even believe that he's going to win the presidential election of 2024. I don't know. I guess I'm horrified or amused to say. I do think that's going to actually happen. But by 2020, it was this, again, a combination of disappointment and then the QAnon cult, the cult of personality, the just ridiculous bombast that dominated his presidency. And I think ultimately led to things like claiming that the 2020 election was stolen, that Dr. Fauci was attempting to kill all Americans with a vaccine, and ultimately culminated in something as bombastic and stupid as January 6th.
But I guess he was always more of a figure than a real politician. I mean, he spearheaded the populist revolution, not just in the US, but I'd say in the rest of the Western world as well. And it's too much to ask from someone who's just this egotistical, bombastic, self-absorbed figure to be a competent politician as well. But he still represents this notion.
Actually. Yeah, I think that's actually fair. I would say this many times, even back in 2016, when I was much more excited about Trump, and I thought there was going to be a breakthrough and everything was going to change, the conservatives were going to fall away, et cetera, that he became president not despite the fact that he was a reality TV star or that he appeared in wrestling competitions. And I'm not joking about the last thing, that he had all of these scandals one after another, that he was in the 1980s and 90s when I was a child. He was on, when you'd go to the grocery store, your mom would take you to the grocery store. every magazine that was being sold at checkout, People or US Weekly or the National Enquirer, Trump, 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 Trump. He became president because of those things and not despite of them. And
he's like
so
part of the, I'd say he's like the part of the Americana, like what's left of it.
Exactly. There's no doubt. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you said is actually fair in the sense that it's too much to ask for there to be coherent policy. But I would say that while that is true, it could have been possible. And I think coming out of that, there could have been a building of a real solid intellectual right with actual policy ideas, with ideals, with critical developments, and nothing happened. It was only a personality cult. And so it's a kind of double-edged sword in the sense that the reason why he hasn't left the American political scene and is still so relevant, I mean, we still live in the age of Trump in many ways, is because of these factors. But then those factors prevent any sort of movement towards a way out of our situation or towards a kind of new intellectual right. So it's a very bizarre thing, but I do think it needs to be recognized. With Trump, the features are the bugs and the bugs are the features. You can't have one without the other. We want some like good right-wing populist, who's morally upright and intelligent and educated, but can speak to the common man. We want that. We're not going to get that. We're going to get a reality show sex star who, grabbed him by the pussy and has said, some of the most ridiculous things anyone's ever heard.
But I guess that's what his supporters, that's the point that his supporters make, is that you have to bring a sledgehammer to the system because the system will not allow the kind of intellectual figure on the right to emerge because he will be claimed a Nazist or racist or whatever. And that's what happened to a lot of people who tried to spoke from the right to the system in the past year. And
yes,
like the unique feature of Trump is basically he can't be canceled. He has to be he has to be recognized as this force, that people bring to the government to say that they are disappointed with the way things were going in the past 20 years.
There's no doubt. I mean, Michael Moore said this in 2016. Michael Moore is a left-wing documentary filmmaker, if your audience isn't aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, look, it's a way of saying fuck you to the world and to your boss and to anyone who has power over you. Because on that one day, as he poetically put it, on that one day, November 8th or first Thursday of November, that one day, if you're homeless or you're a billionaire, you're a CEO, you're a 18-year-old poet, you all have the same amount of power. There's everyone has one vote. And maybe it's an illusion, and maybe it's all theater, fair enough. But it still is real. You go into that ballot box and you vote. And if Trump is best when he captures that fuck you energy, that anti-system energy, but it's an energy that, we need to be frank, is just totally incoherent and it's both violent and stupid at the same time.
Yeah, that's the nature of any political energy, and the problem with Trump is that he doesn't know what to do with this energy. He sort of symbolizes it and embodies it, but he's a bad bureaucrat. He doesn't know how to work systemically with support that he has got. And the problem on the other side, on the left or the central left, is that they refuse to recognize this energy as legitimate. So they are on. That's what fascinates me with the whole the whole Biden-Trump competition, and them going into like the second rematch, basically, of what happened in 2020, is that like it's the same problem, like frozen in time. The left doesn't want to recognize the demand on the right, and the right doesn't have a figure to unite around except Trump.
I think you're exactly right. It's remarkable that you're a Russian who's living in Brazil and you perceive the dynamic American politics. I agree with everything you said. Yes, the dynamic of the 2024 election, assuming that Biden is going to be the Democratic candidate, and also assuming that Trump is going to be the Democratic candidate, is going to be, we need to protect democracy. Effectively, we need to protect the system from this threat. And we can't tell you what this threat is. Trump uses very odd language. He talks about America's blood being poisoned. Oh my gosh, Hitler might have said something like that. We can't really tell you what he's going to do wrong. And we can't really describe what he did wrong in the past outside of bad language. And so what was January 6th? It is an extremely nebulous thing. It was nothing and something at the same time. So
I'd say, to be honest, just to draw like some conclusion, I'd say it was 1968, but like the American conservative version. So, you know, people just following the, you know, just following the energy and the feeling taking over any coherent political messaging.
Yes, it was a truly bizarre event. One of my favorite episodes from that was a woman who was videotaped, who had been tear gassed. And she was complaining about being tear gassed. She's like, I can't believe this. We have no rights in this country. This is a setup. I've been tear gassed. And they said, what are you doing? And she said, well, it's a revolution. And so, you know, if it's a revolution, getting tear gassed is probably the least of your worries, or it's something to be expected. So it was this two things at the same time. Even in the minds of the people who participated, it was a joke and it was nothing. And it was something. It was a total taking back of the country, a coup at the same time. It is a bizarre event, and I think it encapsulated Trump and everything about him.
Yeah, but when we talk about like Trump being a politician, being a good bureaucrat or efficient bureaucrat is only half of the package. So it's not like the politics is more than just being efficient at systemic work. Politics is messaging, and I think messaging is where Trump and his team excels at, and that's what makes your transformation so fascinating to me, because it almost feels like at the cusp of your ideas going somewhat mainstream, you actually back down. 5 years ago, even inviting you to my show in Russia would have caused me much more trouble than it does today, because like the discourse changed on a lot of topics, including like the kind of right-wing messaging that you were famous for 6 years ago.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, Nietzsche had a comment, whenever I hear my own words in someone else's mouth, I start to become skeptical. And what he meant by that is the moment someone is parroting you, you start to question your premises. Like, was I right? What I was saying so hollow that this person could be saying it back to me? So I feel like that in many ways. That's probably kind of the demon energy that I have inside me, that I want to keep questioning and keep pushing. But there's no doubt that there has been a radical transformation in terms of rhetoric, at the very least. You have members of Congress, a figure like Tucker Carlson, people at these mainstream conservative events talking about the great replacement theory, etc. That is something that I would have talked about even
Musk retweeting, like the right-wing memes and things like that. That's part
Musk
of
retweeting memes. Musk said absolutely correct to the notion that Jewish organizations are more or less trying to replace the white majority, and then they start to feel victims when those same people start to attack them. Yeah. I mean, that is unimaginable 5 years ago. So there actually has been a complete transformation in this way. And I guess maybe to some degree, I feel like if I'm going to serve a purpose, it's not to have my thunder or lightning or thunder stolen, or for people to parrot me in some, to be honest, rather half-assed or half-baked manner. It is to keep pushing and keep thinking about where discourse needs to be, or intellectuals need to be 10 years from now. And so, I don't know. I have a certain ambivalent feeling towards mainstream figures who aren't terribly sincere, in my mind, talking about the great replacement and so on like that. It makes me in a way question those ideas and want to dig further. when I hear them become platitudes.
So, but I'd say like, okay, so where do you see intellectually yourself in 10 years? Like, what is this grand idea that you're working on? Because I think in a sense, you became a victim of your own success. Yes, like you quoted Nietzsche just a moment ago. Your idea went mainstream, and it's possible to discuss them now. And in a sense, that the moment they became let's say more convenient, you lost interest in these ideas at all.
Correct. Yes. Well, what I'm talking, my personal project is Apollonianism or REM theory, et cetera. Now, I would say that if you talk to me circa 2009, I was working on some webzines and kind of a journalist of sorts. And I was talking about this idea of an alt-right. And at that point, it was the big tent concept. You know, you're a libertarian. It was actually an anti-George W. Bush concept. Interestingly, I was very much opposed to the Iraq War, et cetera. And it was, I would say, vague, but it was definitely getting at, you know, moving away from the conservative ideology. Now that's done. And I think talking about that now, it doesn't interest me. I find it irrelevant. I do think that there needs to be a real system of values and real ideals for, I guess you could say, Aryan people. That is, people who speak the Indo-European languages, people who are connected on the deepest possible level. There does need to be a move forward out of the collapse of Judeo-Christian culture, which I think even sincere Christians will accept that we're experiencing. So, again, it's hard to give an elevator pitch on REM or Apolloism or my collaboration with Mark Brauman, but it is bringing ideas that Nietzsche was first contemplating in the late 19th century. I mean, he saw everything that we are experiencing today. He saw the horrors of the 20th century. He saw the collapse of values. He saw some, even though he didn't say it explicitly, he saw something like transgenderism entering the world, this total unmooring of any sort of even biological basis to the individual. He foresaw all of these things. And I do believe that we're moving from his crucial insights towards a true understanding of Judeo-Christianity and everything that springs from that: liberalism, democracy, human rights, etc. And we are offering a way forward. And that way forward isn't fully articulated yet. At this point, it's in the ideal stage, but you have to start somewhere. Plato had to start with a dialogue. Nietzsche had to start with books that were read by literally dozens of people. You have to start somewhere. And I think we're actually advantaged vis-a-vis figures like this. But if we're going to have a coherent idea of the West, it has to be coherent religiously, because religion, propaganda, ideals, media, film, art, these are all synonyms. These are all the same thing. And
loss of a coherency in the Western culture and the Western world is a big reason of its decline. I agree on that, but at the same time, you're the Trump phenomenon is bringing sledgehammer to the system that is lost its coherency, and in that sense, supporting Biden is much more akin to supporting this lack of coherency, because basically I think, and I'm talking like from a Russian perspective right now,
sure.
I think the biggest problem that US faces today is actually a loss of ideal, like the loss of vision. You're not like it's not obvious what are you offering to the world today. It was very obvious 30 years ago during the Cold War era. There's this ideal, the castle on the hill, the city on the hill, personal freedoms and things like that. What exactly is the U.S. offering today to anybody?
I have I think the U.S. was offering U2 for lack of a better word. I actually mean that in terms of the band, but you could also, in terms of YOUTOO, U2, you can do this as well. But I mean, U2 and I mean, I know maybe some of your audiences are going to be rolling their eyes when I say this, but I simply don't care. U2 imagined the end of the Cold War years before it actually happened. In songs like New Year's Day and albums like War.
Oh, you can say the same thing about Beatles, you know, and imagining, and the song of Lennon, basically the same thing.
Well, I think that imagines a kind of post-Christian human rights weird place as well. I think U2, there's no doubt that an artist can foresee something, and a prophecy can become reality precisely because the artist places it in the minds of the people listening to it. And so this it wasn't just like, you know, things are more affordable, consumer products in the West, and people like to feel like they have a representative that they can vote for and hold accountable or something. No, it was a Dionysian vision that the West offered the East, which in comparison seemed gray and maybe martial, you could say, and suffocating and boring, etc. And a band like U2 could imagine some point of everyone coming together. We can be as one tonight in this Dionysian energy of self-expression, but also collectivism together. And that is a really compelling vision. And I agree with you when you suggest that at this point, the United States it had this cultural power, which I don't think should be underestimated. And at this point, it's running on fumes. I mean, what is the United States cultural power at this point? TikTok videos of, you know, transgender people talking about their feelings.
To be fair, it's Donald Trump and Elon Musk and things like that. People like that. Okay. Well, at least Elon Musk is definitely like one man who makes the world talk about the U.S. and the remaining prowess that you have.
That's fair. But I think you would agree in terms of its cultural power, it's losing it. And so we don't really have a vision for the future of Ukraine. The vision that is articulated by Western politicians is, you know, Ukraine is a plucky small nation and we should stick up for them. We don't want Russia invading Poland next or whatever. You know, okay, fair enough. But there's not an actual vision for how Ukraine will be part of something bigger than itself that is self-justifying and really compelling and attractive. There's not that vision at all.
Yeah, I absolutely agree on that. And surprisingly, I'm not 100% on board with your take on U2 and imagining this almost like hippie-esque kind of global power. But because what I see and what is evident in Russia and what is evident in Latin America as well, and actually Javier Milei winning the presidential election in Argentina is emblematic of that, is that what energizes the world still is the idea of like the ideas of the founding fathers of the U.S. It's not surprising that Javier Milei, you know, used like there's nothing more far removed from Argentina or from Russia for that matter than libertarian ideals that were formulated around the Gadsden flag, right? You know, in Russia and Argentina, you have to really explain what a Gadsden flag is and why you have this orange flag with a snake and a weird lettering on the bottom. But even still, it has a much more impact on a cultural level than whatever White House and the American administration brings to the table today. So it is possible for Javier Milei to win a revolutionary election in Argentina, relying on those symbols coming from founding fathers of the US. But it's not possible to rely on whatever symbols the American Hollywood or American culture produces today, because what is, again, bringing back my argument, what is the offer? Like, what is the concept that you're offering to the world?
Right. No, I agree with that. I mean, don't you think that Milei is "fuck you" energy at its basis, and that it just so happens to be articulated via libertarianism?
But it's
basically just like
It is a fuck you energy, 100%.
Yeah.
But also, you have to envelope this energy into some coherent message. And the only coherent message that American culture offers today is still a message of 200 years ago. So like Milei could not wrap himself into whatever Democratic Party or Republican Party in the US says, because there is no message there.
Right. I agree with that.
Yeah. Having said that, I think, Nicholas, I also watched your talk with Nicholas Fuentes that you had a month ago. And I think actually Nick has more point than you do, because I think the reason why left had so much success in the past decades is that they successfully memed a lot of contemporary existence. So they basically talked about things incessantly. And I don't know if you saw it, but I think you did. There was this meme on Reddit in 2011 that says, like, what happens if gay marriages will be allowed? Have you seen it now? Basically, like the list of the most absurd things that gradually are coming true and before our eyes, starting from the plague and things like that. So and it's this, and I think that's the same energy that Nicholas Fuentes taps into today. And I think that's where I'd like to hear your perspective, because it feels like you tapped out the moment where you got this radical wing in face of Nicholas Fuentes and people like him, where there were people pulling a consensus in the opposite direction, because you can't have a reasonable debate where one side is constantly it's constantly pulling towards more radical ideas, and the other side is trying to remain in the center. And that's why I think the emergence of you and emergence of Nicholas Fuentes actually was a sign of healing to the American system, because the discussion was coming back, the competition was coming back that was lacking in the last 20 years.
Yes. Okay. Let me try to make sense of what you're saying, because I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah, sorry,
understand
my English is rusty. My English is rusty. Sorry.
I give you plenty of forgiveness on that. We're not having a conversation in Russian, which I would be completely lost, of course. So, yes. Let me suggest this. I do think that a lot of people think of liberalism and all of its effects as almost comical. What's next? Are you going to marry your dog? Or et cetera, et cetera. All these PC outrages, you're focusing on language, is this and that, is now this a bad word? Can you say this, et cetera? But I think it misses the moral component of liberalism. And what we are experiencing, and I think we are actually at the end of it, is this great injunction that is a great moral command that we are in effect obeying. And if you start allowing everyone to vote, so African Americans can vote, women can vote, let's drop the age. The kind of logic that underlies that is going to eventually bring you to supporting transsexual teenagers or all sorts of other things that can be equally justified through that grand moral command of liberalism. I would say it's individualism. But I think I don't even think. I'm sorry. I'm kind of going a little bit further afield here, but if you can just bear with me.
Yeah.
I think we think of liberalism a lot of times as rational, in the sense that it's associated with, say, consumer capitalist economics, is associated with individual rights and law, etc. I don't think that's the true nature of liberalism. In fact, liberalism comes from the word liber. So it's a Dionysian god of oneness and overthrow and degeneracy, if you want to say, etc. There's a bacchanal quality to liberalism. And all of those kind of rational components of it, the individual rights and et cetera, those are kind of ad hoc, post facto rationalizations of what ultimately is a Dionysian urge to bring down hierarchy, to erase differentiation, make the low high, the high low, the meek shall inherit the earth, all of this kind of stuff. And so there's this emotional quality and a kind of moral injunction to liberalism that is ever progressing. And I think it's kind of almost out of our hands. If you talk to a true centrist liberal, and not one who just kind of ironically pretends to be one like myself, but if you talk to a true centrist liberal, they don't even know what's next. Like, should we support bestiality? What do we do with what is often considered pederasty? Or so how do we morally kind of articulate these things? There's a moral injunction, the great command that's outside of their power, that is forcing them to accept all these things. If you talk, I mean, Barack Obama opposed gay marriage in 2009. If you talk to a liberal not too long ago, let's say 2002, and you said that gays will be married, people will be able to change their gender at will, men can become pregnant, they would think this is utterly ridiculous. And they probably do think it's utterly ridiculous on some basic level. I do speak to a number of liberals, and you just have to scratch a little bit and you find that they have opinions that aren't too different from yours. But they're tuned in to the frequency. They understand this moral imperative that is pushing them, that is forcing them to accept these kinds of things. So I would say that reactionary right-wing politics can be effective, and you can just, call out gay books in Florida public schools or so on, or political correctness gone mad on college campuses. That can be very effective. But what it is at the end of the day is resistance, and it's friction. And it's not really fundamentally attacking the moral injunction at the core of liberalism, which is the dominant ideology of our time, if you understand what I'm saying.
No, I absolutely understand what you mean. I'm not sure I quite agree with your definition of liberalism, because like a lot of there has been a lot of meanings being attached to the world to this word recently. But I think the problem is the attempt to create this unified theory of morality, where really the only solution, and there's a libertarian talking right now in me, the only alternative to attempts to create unified theory of morality is actually compartmentalization of society. And that's what I would have offered, and that's, I think, what libertarians offer, is that it's okay to have morals. It's okay to be to associate yourself with the people who share the same moral values as you are, but it's impossible to impose those morals into people who fundamentally disagree with them, or otherwise you're going to threaten your own existence. And I think that's what happened to the West, because by universalizing your own moral imperatives, you actually exposed yourself to people weaponizing it against your society. And that's the reality that we're facing today, is that there's a lot of people who weaponized your moral imperatives and have no problem using it against the host society, so to speak.
I understand that liberalism can definitely be used against the host society, but I would stress that the history of humanity is the history of forcing others to adhere to your will. It's a history of imposing your morality on other people. That's what religion is. It's a binding mechanism. It's a way of forcing someone to do something without using a gun or a spear. There's
is it though? Because you're saying that without using a gun or a spear, but I think it's actually like religion is inevitably leads to a religious war. And I'm not saying it as a good or a bad thing. I'm just constating the fact that if you believe into something strongly and you believe in the universality, yes, thank you, of your beliefs, then you got to fight for it.
Right. Exactly. But the people who are willing to fight, die, and kill are going to win. I mean, so there's this new atheism quote that they love, which is that, Christians say that religion can make a bad person good. And they love to talk about it. You know, they meet someone in prison and give him the Bible, and he no longer robs liquor stores or whatever. But the real question is, can you make a good person do bad things? Can you inspire someone who is meek and mild to engage in an inquisition or torture a heretic or jump over the wall and try to conquer another society to bring them God? And it's only religion that is able to bring that about in an otherwise, quote, good person. But that's why religion is so great. Like, the religious will win. If you're able and willing to conquer your enemy, to force him to be free, then you are going to be the dominant factor in the world. And so I feel like there's no escape from religion.
No, I agree with that completely, but it's a very broad definition of religion. But I guess it can be applied to some communist ideas as well. That you really have to, you really like to succeed and to win, you have to fight, because if you refuse to fight, you're going to lose. And that's what I've been seeing in Western society in the last decades. Is that since the end of the Cold War and since the loss of obvious enemy, outside enemy, there has been no understanding, like, is there anything worth fighting for? Because like the whole concept of a nanny state, life is above all. And I personally feel like the idea that, you have to, I don't want it to be used against me in the future, but the whole idea that there's nothing worth fighting for stems naturally from the concept that there's nothing more valuable than life.
I totally agree with you. The idea there's nothing more valuable than life is utter nihilism. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a great point to move our conversation forward. I actually, again, I enjoyed like theoretical part, but I actually was hoping to talk about some international politics and
we can
the reason. The reason why U.S. has been unsuccessful in majority of its wars in the past decades. I think the last successful war was in Yugoslavia, and since then there was failure after failure after failure. And in my opinion, again, the reason why it happened is because American society has been, in a sense, poisoned by this liberal concept that there's things that a country like there's things that America cannot do that it allows to be done by its enemies. Does it make sense?
Yes. So you're suggesting that we're not ruthless enough to win wars. Is that what you're suggesting?
I wouldn't say ruthless. I'd say that you have no internal reasoning for going to war, and Putin basically and Xi in China is about to call the bluff. So when Putin threatens the world with the nuclear arms, you believe him because he's mad enough, because you've seen him not valuing humans' life. You've seen him throwing hundreds and thousands of people to a meaningless war, and you believe, and because of that, you believe him. And when Joe Biden calls Putin a murderer or a thug, there's like, so what? Like, what are you going to do about it? Nothing.
Right.
And because the answer is you're not going to do anything, you lose. Doesn't matter how much weapons you have. If you're not willing to use it, then you already lost.
I totally agree. I would always push back against any of these, the dangers of World War III or nuclear Armageddon or something. I find all of that to be simply Russian propaganda. Putin doesn't want that as well. Whether even Russia is capable of that, I think actually should be at least questioned. Anyway, I think a lot of these, the theoretical and the, realpolitik allied here. I do think America has a fundamental issue in the sense that it seems to be a kind of hollowed out system without a real core. And what I mean by that is that every society needs a certain hierarchy or class structure that underlies its idealism. And if you don't have that, if you're simply a liberal democracy where anything goes and the people get to decide and etc., then it does raise that question, what are you fighting for? I guess Americans would be willing to go all out if Canada or Mexico invaded us or something, and uh, directly pointing guns at you. But that's kind of easy. I think everyone would defend themselves against a home invasion or something like that. The question with foreign policy is, do you have real interest? And maybe also the kind of unipolar world that occurred after the Cold War, you spread yourself so thin where there's almost nothing there. There's no depth. There's no sense that the United States has a particular culture and real interests that it wants to defend. I think we did have these, and I think there were some remarkable things that occurred with the birth of NATO. That this country, I mean, it came over the German question fundamentally, but this country that we very recently fought a war against is actually worth defending. And I mean, John F. Kennedy, when he spoke in Berlin, the famous, Ich bin ein Berliner speech, he said, there's having a West German passport is the equivalent of being a citizen of Rome. It's actually something that is deeply meaningful and powerful and precious. I don't think anyone would say any of this about the West or the United States at this point. I don't know if we realize the degree to which the concept of the West has been hollowed out, and we only think in terms of, say, self-defense, or we don't want Putin to launch nukes on Poland, etc. There's no real conception of a there, and there's no real conception of an interest. And thus we have these incoherent foreign policies where we get hot and bothered for a year and a half, and then the criticism starts to overtake the enthusiasm, and then we leave, and it's a mess. Afghanistan, Iraq, I'm afraid to say Ukraine.
Ukraine is heading the same direction, I feel, and it's another blow to American diplomacy. But how do you marry this concept of American imperialism and nationalism? Because I feel like those two things you can't really you can't have both. You have to choose. Either you take upon yourself this white man's burden, which you basically reinvent, or you go follow the America First path. And I feel like what America First offers to the U.S. is much more coherent from the inside than what you just said, because at least they are not as contradictory. Because I don't feel like you can have a nation state and an empire at the same time, because if you get yourself involved in the business of other people, the other people become your business.
I'm afraid I profoundly disagree with you. And okay. I don't think the United States has ever been a nation state in its history. And I think to think of it as a nation state is actually quite wrong.
It was a frontier. It was a frontier. I heard that argument of yours, and I agree with that. It's something else. But a frontier is a place, basically.
Space.
It was an open space, and it's basically a space where people who don't want to associate with each other can coexist without associating with each other. And the problem is that frontier is gone.
The frontier was closed in the late 19th century. And you could maybe argue that the United States was a nation state between 1924 and 1965. So a few decades, but some good decades, with the Immigration Act in the 20s that was ultimately transformed in the mid 1960s. There was a coherent white Protestant culture in the United States, but it was a nation state, and it wasn't a frontier in the sense of you do you over there, I'll do me, and we won't, intermingle or something. It actually was a Protestant nation for a few decades. But the fundamental dynamic of the United States is as an empire in different conceptions of the word. The nation state is something that Americans force on other people in order to neutralize them. So this concept of I think a lot of right-wingers like to call it Westphalian or something like that. I find that ridiculous. I think Westphalia had totally different motivations. It's really a Wilsonian order. After the First World War, you had, at the end of the First World War, you have the Bolshevik Revolution. You have this new offer to the world from Lenin and company of Marxism, communism, classless society, radically dynamic and progressive, etc. Woodrow Wilson offered something very different in 1919, and particularly the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. And that is a nation state. We're going to reinvent Poland. We're going to create something that probably wasn't a great idea to begin with, the kingdom of Slavs, Yugoslavia, and all of this kinds of things that had real consequences, but were well-intentioned, to be fair. One of the ironic outcomes of the Second World War is that the nation states in Europe became more coherent. They became less Jewish. And we should be honest, due to the Holocaust and other factors such as that, but they actually came more ethnically homogeneous than they actually ever were. Hundreds of thousands of Germans from the East were pushed out of Russia after the Second World War and re-entered Germany. It was a kind of homecoming and a form of nationalism that was more intense than it had otherwise been, at least when you look at it demographically. It's a remarkable irony of the Second World War is that, in a way, nationalism and fascism, if we were to say that, won silently.
I'm not sure. I really disagree.
Say.
No, I understand where you're coming from, but I just disagree because right after the collapse of the British Empire came, and it brought with itself mass immigration into Britain, and that's where like the modern liberal democracy emerged. That's the condition in which it started to emerge.
Well, okay, but that's where we are right now. I'm talking of a period between 1919 and say 1965, or so like that. And but I guess what I would still stress is that nationalism, the idea that every people is going to have a parliament, you're going to be totally unified, very similar, egalitarian, homogeneous, whatever word you want to use. It's a way of neutralizing powers. It's been a long-term strategy of the United States as a way of containing a country. We don't want a German empire. I think the United States has always been rather ambivalent about the British Empire, although more favorably inclined to it certainly than a German continental empire. And thus, the nation state is a Wilsonian counteroffer to, say, Bolshevism or outright Nazism, or something like that. And so I think the America First, there's a great deal of irony to something like America First. And I do think that most people are well-intentioned who want America to take care of ourselves and etc. First off, they're assuming a coherent population. They're basically assuming a white Christian, or I would even say white Protestant population that might not quite exist anymore. They're also, in a way, disempowering America. America was strong in the 1950s and decades afterward, precisely because it was globalist and expansionist and was everywhere and was fighting a Cold War. How many people became rich through the Cold War, through military contracts, through America protecting the seaways, etc. Even Chimerica, which is coming in the 80s and 90s, post Nixon visit to Mao, Chimerica coming, that was a product of American imperialism. So America became strong precisely because it was expansionist. And this notion of America as a nation state, it's a very strange notion. I mean, you mentioned like turning our ideals on ourselves. It's turning a strategy of containment and neutralization utilized by American imperialists on America itself. And it will inevitably disempower us. We are not going to be as wealthy with a nationalist strategy.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that completely. Obviously, like the imperialism is a historically proven to be an efficient political strategy. But the reason why the U.S. were so successful as an empire in the 20th century is because the U.S. had a vision that brings us back to the topic we just discussed, and because it had something to offer to the countries that were suffering under Soviet regime and under communist regimes, because it was very obvious. On one side side, you have the US, you have the prosperity, you have individual liberties, etc. On the other side, you have this gulag, that murders people by the millions. So it was very easy to choose. Now the choice is not that obvious, and the enemy is not that obvious. And if you ask, someone, if you ask like even Nicolas Fuentes or anyone in the US, what threat does China poses to the US? I don't think you're going to get a clear answer, where in 1960s the answer was very clear. The Bolsheviks will come and they murder everyone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I absolutely. And the fact that we've lost that enemy, I think is extremely damaging to the American psyche. But I don't think even that's uniquely American. I think everyone needs an enemy. Everyone needs a foil. Everyone needs a contrast in order to fully understand yourself. And when you
I agree with that. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'll have to interrupt, because I agree with that notion. Okay. But it's funny when you say that everyone needs an enemy, like everyone has an enemy. You don't need to invent an enemy, because it's already here. Because there are already people fighting you and having opposite goals from the ones that you have as a society or as an individual as well. So the real responsibility of a politician or a public speaker is to identify that enemy, because if you look at the Western societies, at the US or at the Great Britain, you got to wonder, how did it happen that the prosperity has been squandered in the past decades? How did it happen that you don't recognize London anymore? How did it happen that American cities are more dangerous than Moscow or Shanghai? It's not normal. So the enemy is there, and he's working against your well-being. It's just it hasn't been identified, or hasn't been identified efficiently.
I think that's a good point.
And I think, and that's and I think that's kind of what fuels the Trump's phenomenon, and what fuels the populist phenomenon across the world, is that people are frustrated to see the things going like in the wrong direction. They know that there is an enemy, but nobody is capable of saying who that is, except Trump, who basically announces that everyone who doesn't like him is an enemy, which is a foil to the problem.
That's true. They've announced the enemy is now domestic, and I do think it's fascinating. When you think of the Russian example, your average Midwestern American had no problem whatsoever in the 1950s, say, opposing Stalin, or even more benign figures like Khrushchev or Brezhnev was also thought of as someone who wants to, shoot your dog and put your cat into a labor camp, and et cetera, just a maniac. And it is remarkable that your average Midwestern Trump supporter in the 2020s would be like, oh, well, Putin, he's a cool guy. I seen him with his shirt off on a horse, and, he loves Christianity. It's badass and based and all that kind of stuff. It is a remarkable change. It's actually liberals who are identifying Putin and Putinism as an enemy, whereas they probably would have been softer on communist leaders. I mean, it's been a dramatic change. But I think with Trumpism, it's not always articulated in this way, because a lot of times it's like, America was great 4 years ago, and frankly, the liberals destroyed everything and they hate us, and we're going to bring it back better, bigger, and better than ever. They say things like that, this flag waving, pompous, rah, rah, rah. But they really view the enemy as domestic. They view your average liberal, your average journalist, your average mayor of a small town as a communist, as someone
just to make sure, can you don't believe in that, right? So you don't believe the enemy is domestic. Okay.
I don't believe the liberals. To think of the liberals as an enemy is in a way to give them more credit than they deserve. In a way, I think the liberals are better managers of the system, and I don't think they are likely to lose their minds in the way that conservatives do. I do think that the liberals are ultimately quite damaging, and I don't think they will ultimately have a vision for society. But in a purely short-term calculus, I do think the liberals at least have a coherent policy agenda. If we're going to have a better healthcare system, if we're going to have a better environmental policy, if we're going to have a better policy on prescription drugs, it's going to come from liberals, and it is simply not going to come from conservatives at all. I don't view them as the enemy, and I don't give them the credit that they want to kill everyone, or they're these demonic forces possessed by a overcoming will or something. I don't see them as that. I think they're, in a way, boring middle class white people.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I agree with that, because again, going back to your argument that Americans remember when the U.S. was great, 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the win in the Cold War. They still remember how things used to be, and they are different at the moment. And this change, the perceived change and the actual change, makes them seek enemy on the inside. And I don't think it's a particularly American trend. Again, we see the same thing happening in Argentina. Again, the Milei phenomenon is exactly that, is that people started to look for the source of problem on the inside, and they elected the revolutionary candidate. The same thing happened in Great Britain with Brexit. The same thing, to a degree, happens in Russia. The only difference is that the Russian government is so much more authoritarian that it actually can allow itself to crack down on the opposition and basically destroy everyone. So, but the same kind of sentiment is present there, and the same kind of sentiment is present in Europe, because something is wrong in the House of Usher, so to speak.
Yes, rotten in Denmark. Yes.
Yeah, something is. And you mentioned about being competent and facts being on the liberal side more often than on Trump's side, which I wholly agree. But I think the one thing that I disagree with you completely, and I think Nick has a point, and is that I think Western diplomacy and Western politics in general is being held hostage and frankly paralyzed by this idea, by this obsession with being factually correct about things, when the rest of the world and the opposition relies on vibes and feelings in their decision making and in their actions. So there's the saying, that by Ben Shapiro, that I think is very emblematic of that, is that facts don't care about your feelings, but the truth is the feelings don't care about your facts either.
Yes.
You have to take feelings into account, because if you won't, you're going to lose out. And I think that what Trump understands really well, and that what the opposition to Trump refuses to understand at all. And there was this saying in 2016 that you have to you shouldn't take Trump literally, but you have to take him seriously, and that's kind of the same point. So yes, he's serious, and the demand for change is not going to go away unless you address it. And the refusal to address it is actually only makes people like Trump stronger, and only makes the sledgehammer that he brings to the system bigger. So when you say that liberals are more efficient bureaucrats, and they are more efficient in bringing about the laws, etc., but those are not the things that need to be done today, because what liberals are basically doing quite efficiently is bringing ruin to the system they control, because people begin to see enemy as domestic, and they begin to see efficient decision making as detrimental to their well-being.
I respect your perspective, and actually let me add a layer to it, which I think might actually bolster your argument, in fact. So what we have right now is Trump is indicted 100 times, 100 counts, for various crimes, including documents, for racketeering in the state of Georgia to overturn the election, for paying off porn stars, and all of it. Now, I could not care less about the paying off porn stars stuff. I just assume that they're all doing that, so who cares? In terms of the documents case, I think it might very well be that he's a boomer hoarder, and he has broken the law, but he's broken it in a rather comically benign manner. I'm not going to dismiss the notion that he broke it in a malign manner. That is, that these documents are being fed to foreign governments that these governments are funding Jared Kushner's hedge fund. I simply don't know the answer to that question. In terms of the election, yeah, there was a lot of strong arming and crazed rhetoric, et cetera, going on. But I would say this: Trump, as you correctly identify him, is feelings, not caring about facts. It is a religious impulse on some basic level. It's fuck you energy. It's let's bring back the past energy. It's all of those things, all of them combined into one thing. The liberals are attacking him via the legal system. And I think someone like Jack Smith, who's the special prosecutor on a federal level, who's prosecuting him, I think Jack Smith is a competent, educated person. He's probably a good person, if rather tough. I wouldn't want to be prosecuted by Jack Smith, but he's a system man. He's a company man, as we used to say in the 1950s. And he is opposing a religious movement via the legal system. And I think this is actually very revealing to the nature of reality, you could say. The legal system emerges from politics. The legal system is a way for a power that has established itself to rationalize and regulate society. So you can't, at the end of the day, turn a legal system against a force like that. Politics will always trump law, Trump in this case. Politics will always trump law. Law comes after politics. Trump is a political force, and they are trying to take him down with the legal system. And they are going to learn a very important philosophical, Hobbesian, Schmittian lesson by attempting to do this to him. The more they push, the stronger he becomes. Ron DeSantis was leading Republican candidates before Trump got indicted. And his poll numbers have collapsed with every indictment that Trump gets. The more you push against him, whatever your intentions are, maybe Jack Smith's intentions are bad, and he's just like, I hate this Trump character. Let's fuck him over. Maybe that is what it is. Maybe he actually believes in the rule of law. It could be either one, but it doesn't matter. He's using a technicality, in effect, against something that is religious and political, and he will fail. And the ultimate result of the prosecution will be that you elect Trump while he's in prison or in the courtroom or being dragged away by the police. The people are going to elect him to
the perception of injustice will just increase with if that's going to happen. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
And it's actually a great segue to international politics, because I think that's the same kind of mistake poisons the American diplomacy as well, because I think all this discussion around Budapest Memorandum, and Ukraine having the right to sovereignty, and NATO didn't attack Russia, etc., etc. Like this argument falls flat, because that's not what the war is about. That's not the kind of existential war that Vladimir Putin is waging, and the whole response of the U.S. has been, of the international community as well, has been basically not just incoherent, but just inadequate to what's happening. Because if all you have to if all you have to oppose to Putin, if all you have to say is that he broke international law, then you already lost, because nobody's going to fight for international law. People fight for ideas. People fight for religion, as you said. People fight for beliefs, not for some paper that some bureaucrat signed 30 years ago, and majority of people didn't even know existed until a couple of years ago.
Absolutely. I do think that the war is existential on Russia's side. Now, Russia certainly could exist with a Ukraine on its borders, but theoretically, or practically speaking. But I don't think that's how Russians perceive themselves, because all of that talk that about America as inherently empire, I think all of that could be equally said about Russia. Russia is inherently a empire. It is a massive land space that can only be governed through mobilization, that is men on horseback in the Asiatic steppes, through outposts elsewhere. It is not like Finland. It's not even really like Germany, in which you have defined borders and a army state, in effect, in control of a substantial territory. It's much more expansive than that. And if there is going to be any major threat to Russian sovereignty, it is going to be a European or a German army marching through Ukraine towards the Caspian and putting Russia into a knockout blow. It's very interesting that the Christmas Day, end of the Soviet Union came after the Ukraine referendum for sovereignty, in the sense that this is very remarkable. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Putin, very different figures. They all agree on one thing, and that is Ukraine is essential to Russia's imperial stability. And when you've lost Ukraine, the notion of a Soviet Union, an empire, just simply makes no sense. So I do think that this is it's a geographic struggle in the mind of Vladimir Putin. And he is willing to throw another 100,000 soldiers. The estimate of Russian fatalities, or at least casualties, is upwards of 100,000.
Yeah, it depends on what sources you believe, which sources you trust. But it's been quite large, yeah.
Yes, again, 10,000 men apparently died in the Afghanistan campaign in the 1980s. And Americans look back on Russia and Afghanistan. Oh, that was their Vietnam. What a disaster. We screwed them over. Aren't we so smart? We funded the Mujahideen and all that. So, James Bond and Rambo were fighting alongside Osama bin Laden in our movies of Hollywood at the time. And, we're so smart. That was 10, 15,000.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you because this is just very funny.
Okay.
Do you know Michael McFaul? He was the ambassador to Russia for many years, and he's actually the architect of the American-Russian policy. And he had this amazing conversation a couple of days ago. I just want to read it out on Twitter. Michael McFaul writes, if my president killed or injured 300,000 Americans just to occupy a few small chunks of territory in Mexico or Canada, I would be really pissed. 2 years in, it's hard for me to understand why so many Russians support Putin's needless, senseless war. And some user replies to him, maybe this isn't a great fit for his skill set then. Don't you think it's better for our country to be represented by those who are good at understanding things instead? And Michael McFaul replies, I don't get your point. This is an incredible conversation. It's just such an incredible level of stupidity and incompetence.
He's so naive and so historically uninformed. It's just, and it's insulting. And even worse, he's actually from Montana, where I live. So this is the son of Montana made good. And it's Michael McFaul, who should be teaching history in high school, in my humble opinion. I don't even mean that as an insult. I think high school teachers are very important people. But that's his station in life.
He can give some factual knowledge. He's competent in that sense. But as a politician, as a diplomat, I mean,
it's bigger. You have to fully understand this. You can't just say, "I can't believe he sacrificed 100,000 men." You have to. You have to
have a drive to understand why.
Why? Yeah, exactly. Now, maybe you could say, "Oh, he's crazy," and that's possible. But that's not a really sufficient answer. You've got to dig deeper and understand why he would do this and why people are willing to undergo this level of trauma. And he's just not willing to do that because he's just a liberal. But anyway, I said this early on. Who am I? I'm just some guy on Twitter at the end of the day. But I said this very early on in the Ukraine campaign, that we should move immediately to an attempted ceasefire, and that would involve a no-fly zone, and that would involve a fast track of Ukraine into NATO. Now, people would hear those opinions as crazy, fanatical, etc. I think they actually are quite sound. And what I mean by that is that Russia does view this as existential geographic issue that they cannot avoid. So you've got to, in a way, allow them, you've got to give up some of the eastern parts of Ukraine, including Crimea, etc. And you've got to recognize how important it is for them, but also draw a line. A line was eventually drawn in Germany, and this was actually extremely important in the establishment of NATO in the late 40s. I think American policy on Germany, as imperfect as it was fundamentally successful and is fundamentally a good model for what could be used with Ukraine. There is a no-fly zone. We're drawing a line. There is also a establishment fully of Kiev and Western Ukraine as part of the West, that is part of the EU, part of NATO, etc. That will establish a line that I don't think Putin wants to cross. Putin might view this as an existential crisis. He's not going to start World War III, or he's certainly not going to start World War III carelessly. All of those, issues of blowback and regime death, etc., they apply to him as well. But again, this had to be articulated in a way that John F. Kennedy, as imperfect as he was able to articulate that with West Germany. It had to be related that we have something at stake here, that this is part of us and who we are as a political force, as opposed to Ukraine is this poor little country and we've got to just throw a bunch of money at weapons at them. Goldilocks, not too violent, but just violent enough. And we've got to, it just seems like you're keeping this going, that you're just maintaining this bloodbath in Ukraine endlessly without any point or without any articulated vision for how this would go forward.
Do you think the U.S. on a fundamental level is actually capable of drawing that line that you're talking about? Because German solution, for German solution to be possible, requires coherent politics and long-term planning, which right now, with the Democrats, changing, with the Democratic administration changing to Republican administration, is just physically not possible. And again, the reason why Putin became so bold is because he saw, the failure of American diplomacy, not just in Afghanistan, not just in Iraq, but in Hong Kong as well, where you basically, gave up fighting for the people who very much believed that the U.S. will come and save them. The same thing happens in Taiwan right now. Basically, the U.S. is moving the production out of Taiwan, preparing for war and preparing to lose the war. And Joe Biden just a couple of days ago met with Xi, where Xi basically said that China is gonna settle the Taiwan question in the next 5 years. Yes. And is there anything Biden is gonna do about it? It's not obvious. And I'm saying Biden, but basically I mean the U.S. Is there anything Donald Trump is going to do about it in 5 years' time? Not obvious.
I think in this weird, crazy way, and I know that I've been very anti-Trump for some time. In this weird, crazy way, Trump is the only one who could.
He's crazy enough for that. He's crazy enough for that.
He's crazy. This is the thing, because what people say, and they rationally say that if Trump were in charge, he would just sign off on Putin's invasion of Ukraine, just sign away the country, shake hands with Putin, and so on. I think you could just as easily say that Donald Trump would have nuked Moscow if Putin invaded Ukraine. He's not, if you understand, go with me a little bit this. He's not coherent. And it's in terms of let's look at the Israel-Palestine situation. Now, Trump, via Jared Kushner, is strongly connected to the idea of Israel as a Jewish state, etc. He's been very pro-Israel throughout his term. That being said, if there's any one person who could just take a U-turn and force all of his supporters to go along with him, it would be Donald Trump. And so Donald Trump, even now, represents a sort of potential or hope of something. Now, maybe that's a false hope. and maybe Trump is just going to go in office and be another disappointing disaster, and then we're going to have another dumbass J6 on our hands. Fair enough. But if anyone could actually articulate something or actually just turn the wheel of the car and get us going in another direction, it actually is Donald Trump. I feel like Biden is almost trapped in this system. He's not driving a car. He's on a track that is going in a direction in terms of our support of Israel, in terms of our competitive perspective on Russia, etc. And he's not really able to articulate a vision that's new. And a Trump, at least potentially could.
Yeah, it's the same thing that happened with Nixon. He was the only one who was capable of pulling the China deal. Yeah, it's not unprecedented, but it's hard to project what Trump can do, and that's pretty much exactly the point. But just to get back to China and Russia debacle, just a second. Sorry, I have some notes here that I wanted to bring up. I think you're right that Trump is capable of doing all that, but I think it doesn't solve the Trump phenomenon. It doesn't solve the underlying problem of the American system, is that it really has been incapable of playing a long game for 20 years, and the reason, you've invested I think the biggest sin for a diplomat and for a international player is to start doing something and then not seeing it to the end, and that's what's been happening to the American diplomacy for decades. So it happened in Venezuela, it happened in Iraq, it happened in Syria, it happened in Afghanistan. It happened in with Arab Spring, which basically brought a lot of tragedy and suffering, but didn't change a single country to a better. Most of them changed to worse. Syria is worse off than it was before the war. Iraq is worse off than it was during the Saddam's era. Afghanistan, the same thing. Basically, returned to where it was. In that context, there's not much reputation left to the American diplomacy, because basically, and again, the Ukraine is seemingly heading towards the same result. Is that America has its power, it has weapons, it has the money, it has the influence, but it's incapable of using that to seeing things to the logical conclusion. So that actually emboldens people like Putin, people like Xi, and undermines trust, because I feel like one of the major mistakes that Ukraine made is actually believing that US is going to be by its side, is actually believing that all those promises are going to be come true, because US was just never planning to support Ukraine with enough weapons to stop Putin or to take back the territories, etc. And there's a lot of realization going on in the Ukraine itself, that you should have talked to realists and not globalists and not liberals, because liberals don't keep their word.
I agree with everything you said, unfortunately.
Yeah, but it's again, then the Biden. Then we return to this argument that the enemy is really domestic, that the system is at fault, because you can't reform the system that is not capable of serving its function.
So I guess what you're suggesting is that I need to just go back to the well and understand that Trump, however flawed he might be, is this stick of dynamite that we're just going to throw. Because
you see, the thing is, the dynamite is going to be thrown anyhow, because you don't have an alternative, and the only alternative that you're proposing right now is just to try to pull back, the horrible end. But it's going to happen anyway, because there's no alternative.
I think that's very fair. It's going to blow up eventually, so we might as well do it sooner and with a certain kind of foreknowledge of
Yeah.
what's happening, so that we can move forward. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that's what I think. That's why I think that long term, Nick is right in his argument. Even though I disagree strongly with his views and ideas, but from the point of real politics, he's right, because what he's seeing is the opportunity to uproot the system, to do something to it. Because just trying to keep it on life support is just going to make things worse. Because whatever challenges the U.S. faces today is going to get worse in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years.
You're making a very strong point.
Okay, right.
Although,
then,
in my defense, I have been kind of shifting a little bit. I was so outraged by Trump. I was so outraged by J6 as well on multiple levels. I think it was an insult to the art of the coup d'etat, among other things. It was just, I found it so gross, and I just
politics are gross.
I
feel like you're trying to remain, romantic about politics, where you just,
sure.
the politics are gross. That's how things are.
Yeah. In my defense, I kind of have been moving towards a certain kind of ironic appreciation of Trump. I did think Trump was over, and he didn't, because the thing is, he's the best way for these energies to be articulated, and thus he kind of can't be over.
But he's the force within in himself. That's what's special about Trump. The role of a personality in history. That's what he is. He changes things just by existing.
Yes.
Yeah, and you have to.
But Hegel saw Napoleon riding on a horse, and he thought he might have seen the actual Weltgeist, or spirit of world history.
And Trump is that. And Trump is that. Comically maybe, but
yeah.
And going back, I think one final thing that I wanted to discuss is American culture and decline. Again, going back to this vision that the U.S. has to offer. And I think the glue that held American empire together was actually the American culture, the Hollywood, the movies that projected your lifestyle and your values outside, to the outside world, and made the U.S. feel attractive. And it just doesn't exist anymore. The Hollywood doesn't exist as a force anymore. All you see is those Marvel movies that are all the same, and they don't tell a coherent.
Are declining.
Even those are declining, and they don't tell a coherent story of what the U.S. is all about. Like by watching Ant-Man 2, or the Aquaman, there's nothing you're gonna learn about life in the U.S. Unlike the movies, action movies of the 80s and 90s. When you watch Rambo, you understand, what the U.S. is all about. When you watch old Schwarzenegger movies, and that's the reason why American actors of that generation are so hugely popular in the outside world. In Russia, for example, even Steven Seagal, when he's still a figure in Russian media, because he represented. He's one of the many faces of the U.S. that used to be and America of the 1990s and 1980s. I can't imagine a single figure emerging out of American culture today who could take a place not just of Schwarzenegger or, what's his name?
Stallone.
Stallone. Even Steven Seagal, there's not even a Steven Seagal figure in existence. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a major change of Hollywood. Hollywood, as we know it, is a profoundly Jewish phenomenon, and that in itself is very interesting, and I think it carries a great deal of way. But it's also a political phenomenon, as you said, and it's a political phenomenon that bolstered and rode, whether it was driving or riding in the passenger seat of the American empire, I think could be debated. Interestingly, it's a little bit of both, you could say. And where are we headed now? I mean, as we mentioned, even the Marvel movies are declining. But I think there's a bigger thing at play here. And rock is dead as well. There's no the rock stars that are still meaningful. I guess you could say Taylor Swift to some degree, although that's pretty vapid. But the rock stars that are still meaningful are U2, et cetera. That is people in their 50s, 60s, even 70s and 80s in the case of Rolling Stone. There's this way that was a period of time, Hollywood, rock music, rock and roll, etc. Much like there was a period of time in the 19th century where opera was it. You know, Wagner, one of the most important philosophers, actors in the world stage, the Napoleon culture of Germany was writing operas. Operas existed like that. It was this cultural force of change and also a cultural force of popularity, etc. These things are over, and what are they being replaced with? They're being replaced by sludge. And what I mean is that look, it's really fantastic that we can talk together about these important subjects. You're in South America at the moment. I'm in America, and we can have these great conversations. And that's only conceivable with the internet. And that's a wonderful thing, of course. But we're a drop in the bucket of what culture is becoming. Well, you know, thousands of people will listen to this and hopefully benefit by it. But millions of people are watching some, you know, woman masturbate while playing video games, or some, you know, 17-year-old talk about nothing for 7 hours on some stream. And, you know, it's that sludge culture where quotidian life is being digitized and it's existing there. Your friends are online. You don't have friends in real life. And you're ultimately just talking about nothing. And
yeah, it's the culture,
is replacing
I'd say,
Hollywood.
yeah, it's I'd say culture is becoming tailor-made, and basically you consume exactly the type of culture that you want to consume, and it doesn't leave space for being elevated by some higher forms of culture. When, like, in
And
the
there's no narrative.
there's no narrative because it's
Yeah.
tailor-made, and basically, like,
Yeah.
a prompt into ChatGPT, and you'll get, you know, the kind of literature that you want to watch, or the kind of video content that you want to see, and it will be even more tailor-made because that won't have an author anymore. So I think optimization of society is the reason why society is collapsing, but I don't think that the reaction is the answer. I think compartmentalization of society is the answer. It actually brings me back to the point I made earlier, is that at this moment in time, your only path to savior, to say your only path to saving what's dear to salvation. Yes, thank you. Your only path to salvation is actually, you know, associating with like-minded people, and, you know, going to the monasteries, basically, like the Christians did in the Dark Ages, where you try to preserve what's valuable to you, and let, you know, the world eat itself, basically, for a while.
Well, yes, but I mean, the monasteries were, in a way, the Hollywood of the Middle Ages. I mean, Christianity was the dominant culture during the Dark Ages. It's not like people were escaping Christendom. I agree with you that this compartmentalization,
I'd say just one more phrase. I'm sorry. I'd say Christianity of monasteries and Christianity of common people were completely different things, and it's unfair to actually mix the two because there's nothing in common.
Okay. I agree that this sort of fragmentation and disintegration might very well set us free, but I don't think there's any sort of coherent civilization that isn't going to be unified by a broader, let's call it propaganda, media, religious structure that is channeling it in a single direction, and that has a incarnation of its ideals via a leader. I mean, that is the power of even Jesus Christ, is to embody God on this earth right now. And I do think that a coherent civilization will achieve something like that, a ideal becoming real before your eyes. And so I agree with you that this will set us free, but I totally reject this sort of kind of libertarian version of multiculturalism or something as an ultimate ideal. I think it, once we're free, we'll need to guard against this kind of fragmentation in the future.
I think it's futile. I think fragmentation is inevitable, and the best you can do is try to save yourself. And it's actually a very it's inherently Christian thought. And I can't bring up the quote in English at the moment, but the idea is that you have to save yourself first before you can help others to be saved. And there's a lot of truth in that. And there's a lot of truth in that. And I think that's, in my opinion at least, and that's what I've been using in my public speeches, the argument that I've been using in my public speeches, that you really, it's the moment in time where you have to start thinking about yourself. And that's what I think America First movement is all about on the basic level. Obviously, it's not being understood in these terms by Trump or whoever supports him, but that I think that's the energy that moves it forward. The understanding that you have to think about yourself now.
Fair enough. I definitely understand your perspective.
Awesome. We've been talking for an hour and a half. I enjoyed our conversation immensely, and actually, I hope that we're gonna do it sometime in the future again. Because it's been a pleasure.
Anytime, oftentimes I'll be asked questions, and the burden will be on me to kind of keep everything going. But you have the same amount of intelligence, probably more, if I'm honest, on these matters, and I really appreciate it. I very much benefited from the conversation. And so I appreciate that.
Thank you. I don't know how to react to flattery, but thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and I really do hope that we'll keep the talk going, and hopefully the world is gonna sort itself out, and nothing existentially horrible is gonna happen. Thank you, Richard. Thanks everyone who watched us. Всем спасибо. Ставьте лайки, подписывайтесь на канал. И до новых встреч. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes.